Hi guys, so welcome to Evolution Lecture Part 2. We're going to go back to something we talked about last week, which was natural selection. So Darwin, the father of evolution, said that natural selection was the mechanism by which evolution occurred when nature picks the traits. A classic example of that is the peppered moth. So down here in the first side of this picture, we have these peppered moths here. And they get their name from the phase that they have where they're light colored and they look like there's peppered scatter on them. But they come in two color variations, this light color and then this dark color. So when the moths would land on light backgrounds like the trunks of the beech trees found in their native land, these peppered ones would blend right in, they're camouflaged, whereas these dark ones would stick out. And so when predators were looking for a meal, they would spot the dark ones first and eat them. And every time they ate a dark one, it would remove some of those genes from the gene pool. And so over time, you had a much larger percentage of light-colored peppered moths than dark ones. Well, then something happened. The Industrial Revolution occurred, and during that time in Europe, it produced a lot of pollution, and this covered the trunks of the birch trees with ash, and they became dark. And when the trees turned dark, when the moths land on them, it switched who was camouflaged. And so this is the pressure that nature exerted as the environment changed. And so the dark colored moths were actually now better camouflaged and the light colored pepper moths stuck out. So when predators are looking for a quick meal, they find these guys first. And so then the predominant color in these organisms switched from being the light colored moths to being the dark colored moths. If the pollution had continued over time, you could eventually possibly eliminate the light-colored moth genes from the population. But luckily, we got a little smart about things and started cleaning up the environment, and so that was less of an issue. Here's another example with beetles on how evolution occurs. So really, it's all about survival of the fittest. Who survives to pass on their genes and who does not? So looking at these population of beetles, they come in two color morphs. So this is your variation within your population that you must have for evolution to occur. And so these birds, for whatever reason, prefer the green beetles. Either they're easier to catch because they stand out, or they just taste slightly different, or they're just used to eating green beetles. And so over time, they select the green beetles more often, which means the orange ones survive to reproduce. And so then you have more orange beetles and less green beetles until finally your total in population changes. And now these beetles don't look anything like they did before. They're all orange beetles. Now these birds at this point are either going to be forced to start eating the orange beetles or find another food source. We have some different methods of natural selection. Stabilizing selection favors the average form of the trait. So if you look at your picture down here, number 1, these are my little baby alligators. They're so cute. The red is the before bell curve. So this is the natural spread of characteristics with these little alligators in regards to the length of their tails. So if you're a little baby alligator, there's lots of things that eat you. Birds will eat you, larger alligators will eat you, raccoons will eat you. You get picked off. So the idea is that you have this spread of variation within your population initially, but then nature is selecting for the average. And so why would nature select the average tail length? Well, if you're a little baby alligator and you're born with a really short tail, then you're not going to be a very good swimmer because they use their tails to propel themselves through the water. And so you're not going to be able to avoid the predators very well, and you're going to get picked off, and there's going to be less of you. On the other side, if you're an alligator with a super long tail, you might be a good swimmer, but that tail also drags behind you, and that gives especially birds with their long beaks the better opportunity to snatch you up. And so actually it's the average form of this trait that you're a good swimmer, but you also don't have that long tail trailing behind you where you could get grabbed by it, that you're most likely to survive. And so nature is favoring that middle trait. We also see this characteristic when we're talking about human babies. So human babies have an average size, and that is in correlation to the size of the average female's pelvis, so the baby's head can fit through the pelvis. So if babies are too small, they might be underdeveloped and not survive as well. And if babies are too big, mom's going to have problems giving birth to them. Now, in the United States, we would just go to the hospital and have a C-section. But remember, not everywhere in the world has access to the same level of health care that we do here in this country. And this is a worldwide average. So if baby is a huge honking baby, mom might not be able to give birth to that kid. And so the baby and possibly mom would both die. So nature favors an average size for human babies, somewhere around 7 pounds. So most of us are between 6 and 8 pounds when we're born. That's the average size that women can easily give birth to, while the baby is still the biggest it can be to have the best chance at survival. Then we got directional, and like the name says, this is when evolution goes off in one direction. So it favors one extreme form of a trait. So I did this with anteaters. So the ancestors of anteaters, we know from fossils, had shorter snouts. And anteaters have really long snouts because they're eating things like termites and ants that either live deep in the ground or in termite mounds that are built up really high. So these guys have these long snouts, and their ancestors were smaller. So you'll see initially with your red line, mostly small snout anteaters, but we did have some variation. Over time, the anteater's snout has gotten longer, and that's the blue line that we're favoring this one extreme here, because these guys are better at getting food by reaching that snout down way down into the termite mound. And so these little guys with the short snouts are starving and dying, and so evolution is pushing for a longer and longer snout. This is also kind of what we saw with the giraffe, right? The longest necked giraffes were the giraffes that got the food, and short necked giraffes were the ones that died. And that's how evolution occurs. It's favoring a trait. Then we got disruptive. Disruptive is when you favor both extremes and the middle guy does not do well. And disruptive is not that common, but it does occur. So I did this one with these little clams here. So I got clams in 3 different colors. Normally, the sand-colored clam might do the best because he is going to blend in with that sandy environment and not stand out and be camouflaged, right? But let's say there's a change in the environment, which is what you usually see with disruptive. There's some extreme change in the environment. There's an underwater volcano or a volcano near the edge of the water that explodes. And so what you get from that is you get some lava rock, right, which is dark in color, and you get some ash, which is light in color, and that covers up your sand. So in that case, on the black rock, the darker colored clams are going to do the best because they're going to blend in. And if any of these other two are over there, they're going to get picked off. Over on the ash, where it's very white, all right, these little white-looking guys are going to do well, and the other two will get picked off. And this poor yellow one, he's going to get picked off no matter what because he lost the habitat that he was previously camouflaged into. So over time, disruptive can actually make two totally new species. Because if these guys are isolated on the black rocks and these guys are isolated over on the ash, they may not interbreed anymore. And so these guys will all breed with each other, and these guys will all breed with each other, and they'll develop their own differences over time that could create new species. Another type of evolution is called co-evolution, and there's that co there, like cooperate. So they are evolving together. It's when one species evolves in response to another one's evolution or change, right? And a classic example is the cheetah and the gazelle. So the cheetah is the fastest land mammal on Earth, and the gazelle is just slightly slower. And the reason why this exists, it's kind of like an evolutionary arms race where one guy gets a gun and the other guy's like, well, I'm going to get a bigger gun. And then he's like, well, I'm going to get a torpedo. And then he's like, well, I'm going to get a nuke. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing, but with biological body structures. So the gazelles are very fast, and they're going to catch the cheetahs are very fast, and they're going to catch the gazelles that are the slowest, right? The easiest pickings. So the slow gazelle genes are going to be out of the gene pool, and it will only be the fastest gazelles that survive, and they reproduce and pass on their traits. So their babies are fast, right? So then out of your population of cheetahs, only the fastest cheetahs can catch these fast gazelles, and slower cheetahs are going to die because they're going to starve. And so over time, you can see how these guys just keep getting faster and faster and faster. Now, there is a limitation to how fast they can get because they're biological organisms. Their bodies can only change so much, but we don't know where exactly that limitation is. Another example, this is between an animal and a plant, because plants can also evolve. This is a little flower that gets longer and longer, and this is the moth, and this is their mouth. When the moths fly, this mouth curls up under them, but when they're ready to feed, they stick it out, and then they put it into the flower, and they slurp up the nectar. Now, the flower doesn't really want the moth to slurp up their nectar, so the longest flowers get to keep their nectar, which means they have more energy to reproduce. And the shortest ones are the ones that are going to get eaten from first. Well, as the flowers get longer over time, because the longest ones get to reproduce more, these guys, only the moths with the longest mouthpieces, can get in there and get the nectar. And so over time, these moths have gotten these ridiculously long mouthpieces. Now, once again, there will be a limit to this because at some point, the weight of this proboscis, it's called, will be so much that it will hinder them being able to fly, and then they would die off. So there is a limit, but they can get stupid long. So here's our cheetah chasing after a gazelle, and you can see that he's working hard to catch him. And here is another moth, and you can kind of see the mouthpiece that curls up there, sticking that into that flower to feed from the nectar. Nature is pretty awesome, y'all. We also have divergent evolution. To diverge means to become different, right? So divergent is the process by which related species, so they have a common ancestor, a recent common ancestor, and then they evolve into all these different organisms. The classic example of that is marsupials. So marsupials are all the animals that have pouches, and most of them live on the continent of Australia. And the reason why they live there is because the first organism that was a marsupial must have lived on that continent. And then from there, they adapted, because Australia is basically just a big island, so it's isolated. They adapted to all these different roles. And so what happens is you have this ancestor of all marsupials that turned into marsupials that take on all the roles that the animals in our country take on. Like the Tasmanian wolf, who is now extinct, but he became a dog-like animal, but he's actually a marsupial, has a pouch. Kangaroos in Australia are equivalent to deer here in our country. They're grazers. They have a native cat that's not actually a cat at all. It's a marsupial with a pouch, but it looks very cat-like because it eats the same kind of foods and lives in a similar type of lifestyle as cats. Koalas are their version of bears. There's no bears in Australia. They have a flying phalanger that is similar to a flying squirrel that you would see here, or our squirrels. All right, they have their own marsupial anteater. They even have marsupial mice. They're super cute. They have little pouches. All right, and there's some other organisms as well, even a marsupial mole. So all these guys are marsupials, have a common ancestor that was a marsupial, and they have diverged to take advantage of different habitats, just like the animals in our country have. So the opposite of divergent evolution is convergent. So that means to come together. Convergent evolution is when organisms are not closely related at all, but they look similar because they're living in similar environments. So they're adapting in similar ways. So earlier we talked about the Tasmanian wolf, who is a marsupial, right? And he looks like a dog-like organism, but it's a marsupial. And then we have a placental, which is a dingo, which is related to dogs, right? And so these guys look very similar because they're in similar habitats, hunting same kinds of food, but not closely related at all. We can also look up here with a shark, an ichthyosaur, and a dolphin. So a shark is a cartilaginous fish. An ichthyosaur was an aquatic reptile that lived in the time of dinosaurs. And the dolphin is a mammal just like we are. They produce milk for their young. Okay, they just lost all the hair. So none of these are closely related, but if you look at their bodies, they're very similar because they're adapted to an aquatic lifestyle. In order to be fast in the water, you have to be streamlined. In order to swim well, flippers work best. Okay, and even their tail fin, the dolphin's tail fin goes in a different direction. It goes up and down. these guys go side to side, but still just to propel you through the water. So that's convergent evolution, when you don't look similar, you're not related, but you land up looking similar because of the environment you live in. All right, so here is some more of that convergent evolution, which goes back to organisms looking similar. So remember how we had all those marsupials in Australia? These guys diverged from a common ancestor, but they converged with organisms that live in similar environments on other continents, okay? And so you can see the similarities between these organisms, even though they evolved independently of one another. Something else that happens with evolution is this thing called genetic drift. Genetic drift is when there's changes in the frequencies of alleles or genes within your population. And this can happen a couple different ways. One of the most common is what's called a bottleneck effect. A bottleneck effect is when you have this full population, if you look down here at the bottles, with all these genes in it, and then something happens where part of the population is separated. And when they're separated, you don't necessarily get the same percentage of genes represented that you would in the whole population. And so when they breed over time, the population looks different in the end, okay? So for example, if you imagine humans, genetic drift, bottleneck effect could happen with humans, but if you had humans that were stranded on a desert island and you had, 2 girls and 2 boys, let's say keep it simple, and those individuals were all Caucasian, for example. Because they were all Caucasian, that doesn't represent what really goes on in humanity as a whole, because we're very diverse as Homo sapiens. But if they're all Caucasian and they reproduce, all their future offspring are going to be Caucasian too, and they will have a different genetic makeup than humanity as a whole. All right, we have some real life examples of the bottleneck occurring. So with seals, the bottleneck occurred where we had all these different colored seals. They came in a huge variety of colors, okay? And people used to hunt seals. They used to club the babies to make fur coats out of them. It was really sad because their babies are adorable. But they hunted tons of seals for their meat and for their fur, and they just killed them off randomly when they were babies before they even really knew what color they are because they were all white. So they killed off a whole bunch of them, and then they had this leftover population. At this point, people are like, hey, we better save this population and stop hunting them and breed them back. And they did. They bred them back, and the seal numbers have returned. But when they returned, they were bred from this smaller population that did not have the diversity the original population did. So when you look at seal colonies now, there's not as much diversity, which means, that leaves them vulnerable to things like disease. We're seeing the same thing in cheetahs, all right? Cheetahs have had a really hard time because their habitats have become fragmented, which means cheetah populations are kind of isolated in these little reserves. And it takes a lot of land and a lot of resources to feed a big cat. So because there's so few cheetahs, their numbers have dwindled, and then people protected them, and so they're trying to breed them back, but they're having problems because it turns out that cheetahs are all genetically very, very similar, and that's really bad for things like disease and genetic disorders showing up in the population. And so they're having problems with diseases, killing off entire populations of cheetahs because they're so closely related to one another because of this bottleneck effect. The other thing that can happen is the founder effect. So remember when I just talked about putting humans on an island together? That actually would be the founder effect as well. When you have a small group from one group of a species that colonizes a new habitat. When they're in that new habitat, you lose some of the genetic diversity, and those that are isolated are going to breed within themselves. And so any mutations occur are going to stay in that population, and over time, they're going to become different, and you could land up with a totally different species. And this happens very, very often in nature. So example of founder effect with humans is with the Amish in Pennsylvania. So if you ever get a chance, go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They have a large population of Amish there, and you will see a lot of horses and buggies and things like that, and it's very charming and a really nice place to visit. But with that, the Amish that were founded in Pennsylvania in their own little area there in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was a small group of individuals. And because the Amish marry other Amish, there were not a lot of genetic diversity. And then within that group, there was somebody who had dwarfism and somebody who carried the genes for something called polydactylism. Polydactylism is when you have extra fingers on your hands. So when you go into Lancaster, Pennsylvania, there is a way, way higher incidence of seeing people with dwarfism or polydactylism than there would be anywhere else in the world because of that founder effect. Those original genes were in that original population and they all interbred and they continue to interbreed within their own little groups with limited genetic diversity, and so those genes show up a lot. All right, so there is dwarfism and polydactylism. Another thing that can happen genetically that we're having to deal with in our medical community is antibiotic resistance. So antibiotics work on bacteria only. We're not talking about viruses here. When antibiotics work on bacteria, they kill the weakest bacteria. That's what they're designed to do, to give your body a chance to fight off the rest of the infection so you can get better. Well, a couple decades ago, people just didn't realize that the bacteria were evolving when we exposed them to antibiotics. And so doctors were over-prescribing antibiotics. And people were getting them for things like the common cold and stuff, viral infections that the antibiotics didn't really do anything for. They just prevented secondary infections from bacteria from occurring. And so they would give them to you to kind of make you feel better. But the bad part that came out of that is when you expose bacteria to these antibiotics a lot, they mutate over time. So you expose them, you have a mutation, because that's how we get our variation within bacteria, because remember they reproduce asexually by binary fission. Once you get the mutation and one of them is resistant to this antibiotic, that's the one that survives and reproduces. And all the easy to kill bacteria die off. And so now these ones that are resistant don't even have any competition for space or anything from the weaker bacteria. And in the end, what you land up with, I went too far. What you land up with is bacteria that the antibiotics do not work on anymore. And that's where we're at now, that we now have these bacterial infections that are antibiotic resistant, like MRSA. We used to be able to wipe out really easily, but because we've overused these things, we overuse them medically, we give them to our livestock because we're factory farming, and that is just overexposure. And the pharmaceutical companies have not developed a lot of new antibiotics, though they are working at it now. All right, so this is something for you to be aware of when you're going out and buying antibiotic soaps and things like that, that if you're overusing these products, that you're actually just putting pressure on the bacteria to evolve and become a bigger problem. And honestly, with an antibacterial soap, it's the process of running your hands together and using the water that removes plenty of bacteria. You don't even need that stuff. It's just a gimmick to get you to pay more. Sorry about the bell. So when you are talking about these processes, what they can do is they can create new species, and that's speciation. One of the very common ways we make new species is through geographic isolation. So geographic isolation is when there is a physical land barrier between populations, and so they all accumulate their differences. So if you look at my little insects over here, here's my original population, and I have variation in my population, which you must have for evolution to occur. And let's say the environment changes. A little stream forms here, so we had a really wet season. This isolates my two groups. This is just like a founder effect, right? Isolates their groups, and this group has these genes, and this group has those genes. Over time, when they breed, because of the genes that were represented in there, there's a little more green genes in here, a little more light brown genes over here, and so the population starts looking different. And the longer they're separated, the more different they're going to look. And that's how you get new species, you know. Things like different kinds of tigers or different kinds of birds and things like that. So if you put these two species back together over time, they might physically be very similar, but they look different. So they would be reluctant to breed with each other. And if they don't breed with each other, that's what separates them as a species. Because a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If they will not normally breed in nature, they are considered different species. All right, so some other things that can happen with speciation, besides geographic isolation, you could have reproductive isolation, where there's not necessarily a physical barrier between you, but some other things could happen. And so you could be pre-zygote or post-zygote. So pre-zygote means they don't even get to a point where they will breed together. And this can happen when populations within a species, for whatever reason, start developing different mating seasons. And we do see this, and actually we're seeing it more with climate change, because climate change is changing the time of year when some organisms are mating and other ones aren't getting the message, and it's kind of messing up mating seasons. Or something happens with them where they're not recognizing the organism as a potential mate. This happens with birds. If a bird changes its song, then it can't sing to or court its mates quite the same way, and then they're going to be unsuccessful. And so if this happens within groups, it can actually separate out the groups into separate species over time. Then you got post-zygote. This is when they did actually mate and there was fertilization occurred where sperm fertilized an egg, but their offspring are sterile, which means they can't make more babies. So, or they don't even get to a point where the baby fully develops. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples of those here at the end. So here's an example of pre-zygote where they don't even get to a point where they're going to interbreed. So here I have these different kinds of frogs. All three of these species of frogs are very closely related, and physically they're perfectly capable of breeding together. If you put them in captivity, you could force them to breed together, but in nature they're not doing it because for whatever reason they have had shifts in their mating seasons. So you can see by their scientific names, they're all in genus Rana, so they're all related, but they have now different species names because they've separated out, and in the past they were one. But what happened is these guys, if you look, these are the months in a year, so January, February, March, April, May, and so on. These guys are mating in the fall, right? September, October into November. These two are mating early in the year. These very early, February, March, and these guys in April and May. Now these two groups overlap just a tiny bit here. So if they're near each other, you might get some exchange of genes between the two groups, but these guys are not going to mate with those guys at all at this point, right? They do not even overlap. They're not mating in the same season. So even if they could physically do it, if they could fertilize each other's eggs, it's not going to happen. And so these guys are already reproductively isolated. Then we got post-zygote. So we got a couple examples here of post-zygote fertilization. A great example is the mule. Mules are not their own species. They are a hybrid. And so it takes a horse and a donkey to make a mule. And all mules are sterile, which means you can't take two mules, breed them together, and get more mules. It doesn't work. If you want more mules, you have to go back to the horse and the donkey. And the reason why that happens is because the horse and the donkey have a difference of one chromosome between the two of them. And so when they reproduce, it messes up the mule a little bit chromosomally, which makes them sterile. And they just can't. They can't produce viable sperm and egg. Over here, we got the lion and the tiger. Now, lion and tigers, they are in the same genus, right? So they're somewhat closely related, but they've been separated geographically for a long time and turned into two separate species. In nature, they would never breed together. As a matter of fact, a lion, because it lives in a pride, the pride of lions would probably kill a tiger who lives in a solitary situation because they're very territorial and would never think to mate with it. But in captivity, when raised together, they will mate with each other, and what they produce is the liger, okay? And the liger is gigantic, all right? And it has to do with their genes that control growth, because of the genes are so different between these guys that these guys literally have, they just don't stop growing, which is not good for the animal. It can lead to a lot of health issues. But ligers are a hybrid, And ligers are interesting because these two animals are closely related enough that some ligers are not sterile, though most of them are. All right, so there's been reports of some of them not being. All right, so these are both good examples of post-zygote. All right, guys, that's all we got for now. Bye.